and welcome back to another episode of 7 Minutes in Heaven, a podcast devotional for educators. I am your host, Pratiá Jordan, blogger-in-chief of Prayer and Pedagogy.com, where our mission is to edify, equip, and encourage educators everywhere. This is episode 20, The Generous Classroom. Let's get into it. Now, before we start, I just want to say right up front that when I talk about generosity in this episode, I am not talking about anything that has to do with money. Personally, I am very anti-educators spending their own money on their classrooms. It is a frustration of mine to see my colleagues and my peers pouring out their own dollars, especially considering when I look at the way that pay is not equitable for the work that we do in education quite often. And so when I'm speaking of a generous classroom, I just want to say up front, I am not advocating or asking for any teacher anywhere to spend their own funds and their own resources in their classroom. Now, I will write a grant in a hot second, and I love doing that. I have funded my classroom through very generous grants throughout the years, but that is because I am a very staunch advocate of not spending my own money to do my job. So I just want to put that out there up front. Breathe. Woosah. Okay. I am not going to be encouraging or advocating for you to spend your own money in your classroom. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into this episode. Today's word comes from Proverbs 3, verse 27, and it says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to act." Now, I've been reading this verse over for the last few months, and I've really been turning it over in my head every time it pops up, because I was just kind of wondering, what does this have to do with me? Like, why I feel like this keeps coming back up and speaking to my heart as an educator, but I hadn't really solidified the connection between what I felt like the Holy Spirit was trying to impress upon my heart until quite recently. And when we're talking about a generous classroom, as I said before, and I'm thinking of myself as the teacher and the facilitator in my classroom, what does it look like for me to be generous in my classroom, and how does that connect to this verse in particular? Because that's the word that kept coming to me. There was a mentality of overflow that kept connecting with me and this verse, and I finally figured it out. 3 things that I believe we should do to have a generous classroom based off of what this proverb is telling us. Number 1, pour out. The very beginning of the verse says, "Do not withhold." And so sometimes when I see things in the negative, I like to flip it into a positive, and vice versa in the Bible. And so when talking about do not withhold, do not keep or retain, the opposite of that I see is overflow. It is pouring out, and it's pouring out good. And I think when you pour, that there is multiple ways to pour. What pops into my head is my daughter, who's 5, or my son, who's 2, both very independent. I want to do it, toddler stage in their lives. And, when they are wanting to make a bowl of cereal or to put water in their cup and they want to do it themselves, when they pour out, they are very generous. It comes from a lack of the ability to control. But I just kind of wonder, what would it be like to have that same willingness to be generous and to pour out good in our classroom? I think sometimes in education we have this conversation about, should we reward people for just doing what they're supposed to do? Why should I have to encourage or incentivize or reward students for doing what they're supposed to do? And sure, maybe that's not a requirement, but I think that in a generous classroom, the desire and the willingness to pour out good, to not withhold it, is what makes a classroom generous. And so I think that coming into our classroom with the ideology, with the belief that we can pour out, is the first place that we need to start. Second, I think it's important that we seek out The verse says, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due. I think this is important because I feel like in order for this sense of generosity to be effective in a classroom, to really impact and change the environment of a classroom, it has to be authentic. Kids know when you are just giving them a good job or a high five and they haven't really earned that. And research has shown that that type of inauthentic praise or celebration isn't really effective or beneficial. And so I love that this verse is specific about not withholding good from those to whom it is due. I think this is great because I don't feel the need to celebrate negative behaviors. I don't feel compelled to celebrate people who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or that I have to lie and make up stuff. But what I do think that I am encouraged to do here is to seek out those to whom good is due. And for me, this is great because it's really about pushing me to be intentional about finding those for whom good is due. Oftentimes, it's the kids who are doing what they're supposed to be doing, who show up, who are respectful, who may be quieter and don't participate as much, but who don't necessarily demand our attention in negative ways. They get overlooked. We're often busy reprimanding little Johnny or telling Susie to sit down or talking to David about where's your homework. And the students who just show up and do what you ask them to do sometimes get overlooked. And so when we are seeking out the ability, the opportunity to give good, to pour out good for those to whom it is due, I think it is a great opportunity for us to be intentional about looking for those kids to whom good is due. And then lastly, act out. I love that this is all about being self-motivated and self-driven to be generous. This does not require a program. It doesn't need a mandate from your administration. It doesn't even require their support. This is something that we are able to do individually within our own classroom, that once we have decided to have a mentality of generosity, that we are going to pour out. And then we follow that up by being intentional in seeking out those to whom good is due. The last thing is to act out, to actually put that into action and to find ways to be generous. Now, as I said before, this does not require funds. This does not mean that you have to go out and buy treats or rewards or trinkets or anything of that nature. What it may look like is giving a genuine compliment to a student who is demonstrating growth. It may look like giving a very specific feedback to a student on a sticky note with a smiley face. It may sound like, wow, Jonathan, I really enjoyed your contribution to our class discussion earlier. It was so nice to hear from you. Or, hey, Susie, I really like the way that you were supportive of Jonathan when he asked for some help. Thank you for being such a great helper in our classroom. Those are the ways that we are able to pour out a generosity, that we are able to seek out those to whom good is due and then act out by giving them their due. And I think that if we have that mentality, not only will it help positively impact our classroom culture, I know for me personally, I feel so much better when I'm intentional about looking for the good, when I am determined to compliment 5 kids in my classroom before the bell rings, when I am purposeful about looking for 3 students for whom I can call their parents and ensure that they have a great weekend. That makes me happy. It makes me joyful. I have a much better time in my classroom, and I'm not as focused on the negative behaviors and the negative things that may happen because I'm so intentional about being generous with authentic praise, reward, and support in ways that help my students and I connect and that really help cultivate a positive culture of generosity in the classroom. One bonus that I've seen of doing this is that as a model in my classroom, my students begin to do the same thing with each other. And that is just amazing. So I think overall, the generous classroom does not require funds. It does not require dollars, but it does require the desire to pour out, to seek out, and to act out in a way that can positively impact us all. So here is your hashtag 7-minute challenge for the week. Set out this week to not withhold good from at least 5 students or staff that you encounter this week. I promise you'll have a much better week because of it. This has been episode 20, The Generous Classroom. Thank you for joining me at the intersection of prayer and pedagogy. See you next time.